Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin was on Meet the Press yesterday, among many other things. He started talking about how it may be that we are seeing this impeachment affect our international relations.
Those individuals that leaked this, if their interest was a stronger relationship with Ukraine, they didn't accomplish this. Having this all come out into public has weakened that relationship, has exposed things that didn't need to be exposed.
Well, I caught the attention of our guest, Dr. William Rosenberg, is professor of political science at Drexel University, co-author of News Verdicts, the Debates and Presidential Campaigns. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg. Bill, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good morning.
So why did that catch your attention?
Well, what was really remarkable is it's one in a chain of several defenses that seem to be changing over time for those that are defending President Trump and how his behaviors are problematic for the United States. Essentially, what Ron Johnson was saying was, we can't have these conversations leaked. We can't really know about a lot of the things that are done behind closed doors because it's going to weaken the relationships between ourselves and other countries. And this goes back to one central difference between the supporters and the detractors of Donald Trump, where Trump says, I can go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and others are saying, if you do something that's illegal, you should be punished for it. In terms of the president conducting foreign affairs, I think we're in a really unique situation in the sense that a lot of the types of behaviors that Trump has been participating in are being unmasked, and people are perhaps going to have a new way to view how our leadership should be conducting itself.
You make it a really interesting. I was going to say you make a really interesting. Go ahead, make your point.
I don't know what his underlying point is it's simply that if you're exposed for something you've done wrong, you shouldn't be held accountable or punished. I don't really understand the argument all the way through, though.
You make an interesting point because, we're all familiar with that Office of Legal Counsel from the Justice Department saying the president can't be indicted for an offense while he's in office and might eventually have to pay the piper. But this is not illegal. This is a political process that's underway right now. The question, I guess, is if people are seeing laid bare some of the personal traits of President Trump, is that going to be persuasive enough for people who support him to make them, well, in terms of the public, not vote for him, in the terms of the Senate, whether they're going to, if it does get to the Senate, which everyone believes it will, whether they would vote against the president or go against the president? And that, I guess, is one of the bottom line questions here.
Well, I think you make a good point. I think ultimately the question is how much will the president's coalition of supporters remain with him. And I think that we've seen in the last week or two some research that's shown that particularly among white, less educated women who sort of flipped and voted in the Republican camp in 2016, their support has waned a bit. And the idea is that while we talk about various constituencies in elections all the time, it's not just changing sides and voting for the opposition, but it's also sitting on your hands and deciding, you know what, I'm just not going to show up on Election Day. This whole thing has gotten out of control. And I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump has to worry about.
Bill, the conviction of Roger Stone this past week, and it's kind of curious to see what President Trump does or does not do in the wake of that conviction. We've seen him sour on some people that he previously had embraced, the Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, people who have worked for him, John Bolton, for example, and it may be that some of the people come back now, and it's kind of going to be interesting to see how he deals with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, one wonders about how much people process those sort of interpersonal relationships. It's clear that in D.C. we focus on this a lot as process stories, palace intrigue, whatever you want to call them, but the question is whether or not that's something that voters actually think that much about.
Well, I think that the timing of the conviction was very ominous for what's going on with these impeachment hearings. I mean, essentially, Wednesday sets up the day when Gordan Sondland comes back, a man who has already changed his testimony, who is basically a Trump appointee, a Trump fundraiser, an always Trump person, not a never Trump person. And the question is whether or not Gordan Sondland, now with the recent evidence that's been put forward by David Holmes, who overheard the conversation in a restaurant terrace in Ukraine where the president basically said, I don't really care about corruption. I care about Joe Biden. What is he going to do? And now that he's seen that there's been a series of people that have gone to jail that have been in Trump's camp, the question is whether or not he will continue to try and save himself from that same fate.
Bill, what lessons do we learn on things like executive privilege and the power of the executive versus the power of the legislative branch?
Well, the Constitution lays out three equal branches of government: the courts, the legislative branch, and the president. These constant conflicts tend to be between, though, the president and the legislative branch, with the court serving as an arbiter. I don't think there's really anyone that really wants to get rid of executive privilege or keep information that is private conversations between the president and world leaders completely open to the American public. The question is that if there is something going on that is either illegal or untoward, then perhaps the veil has to be lifted a little bit. I mean, I'm sure we can go in virtually every administration the United States has had, and there'll be less than some proud moments there if we knew everything that took place. The reason why this is catching so much heat in this Trump current impeachment process is that the president is using his power, apparently, for his own personal political gain, not as it's probably been used before, for the gain of the American public. And I think that's really where the rub comes in for the defense of Donald Trump. If he was doing this purely to protect U.S. interests and for good causes, the impeachment hearing would probably fall flat on its face. But the fact that he was specifically going after Donald Trump's chief rival, Biden, and is continuing the saga of going after Hillary Clinton in the election of 2016 with these servers has sort of unmasked really what's going on, and I think that's what's problematic for Donald Trump.
For the generation that remembers the most recent impeachment, that is of Bill Clinton, one can be reminded of, and I think Bill Clinton himself referenced this last week in an interview with Jake Tapper, where you got to talk about the job you have to do. In other words, his approach during the impeachment hearings was to say, look, I'll let other people answer questions. I've got a job to do. I'm trying to help the American people. In other words, at the very least, you want to have the appearance of being focused on the agenda that is most interesting to America as opposed to your own personal agenda.
Yeah, I think that Bill Clinton was able to very much compartmentalize his personal, saga of the impeachment versus his role as president. And interestingly enough, when Clinton was not removed from office, people still thought that he was going to be damaged goods and wasn't going to be able to accomplish much. And from that very famous TV program, Seinfeld, where the soup Nazi would wave his finger back and forth and say, "No soup for you," Bill Clinton did the same thing. He made it clear to the Republicans that while he may have been damaged in some ways, as President of the United States, he still has the power of vetoing legislation. And as a result, the Republicans were not able to run roughshod over him in terms of the legislative agenda.
And he didn't talk about the victory in the impeachment hearings all the time. He did say, "I'm president," but it was not about, hey, didn't we have a great win? You know, and I'm just sort of borrowing the way that President Trump tends to approach things. Like, for example, he's still 2 years after the election talked about how he won in Wisconsin.
Right. I think you make a really interesting point. The other thing is that I would say that particularly the House Democrats have had this long dilemma about whether or not to even begin this process, because they felt very early on that while they had the votes to impeach the president, they probably would not have the 67 votes to remove him from office. And as we saw after each time the president got in trouble and was I'm going to use the word in quotes, exonerated with regard to, let's say, Mueller and Barr coming to his defense, he basically said, look, there was nothing there. I'm the greatest president ever, and we're just going to move on. This situation is somewhat eerily similar in the sense that if Trump is not removed from office, he's going to be doing the same thing, that, look, this was a partisan hack attack job, and that ultimately truth won out, and I've done absolutely nothing wrong. So this was a big fear going into this process by the Democrats, although I don't think that the Democrats really expected to get so much information that undercut President Trump in this narrower sort of inquiry about Ukraine, including William Taylor, George Kent, Vindman, Morrison, now Yanovovich, and now David Holmes. You mentioned on your promo for later in the day, Mike Pompeo is going to meet with the president today. Mike Pompeo has been completely absent in this whole process, and it was his folks that were very much deep in the mud in what was going on in Ukraine, through Gordan Sondland and others. So it'll be interesting as we watch these 8 people come forward this week, whether or not the credibility of these people, both the former supporters of Trump and current sort of antagonists in a sense to Trump by their testimony, their credibility is going to hold up versus the president, who has been accused, and there's some debate somewhat about this, of over 10,000 lies that the Washington Post has documented. So when you're comparing sort of the evidence, you have to look at war heroes versus Donald Trump, and the American public is going to have to decide who they believe.
That is how they will proceed, and that's we'll see how it turns out. Dr. William Rosenberg. Bill, thanks for being here.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. His thoughts on the politics of impeachment, tweeting at Dr. as in Dr. B. Rosenberg, Rosenberg.